Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to the maiden voyage of Salka's Soapbox. We're going to be talking today to Sheriff Todd Hood, who is the Madison County Sheriff, and we're going to be going over some issues that obviously affect law enforcement in Madison County, and in particular the bail reform that was passed a couple years ago in the New York State Legislature. Sheriff, thank you. Welcome.
It's always, my pleasure.
Always good to have you here. And
thanks for having me.
So essentially, Sheriff, what we'd like you to be able to do is to talk to us about what bail reform has done and how it's impeded your officers in being able to do their job, and how it has the potential of really compromising the safety of a lot of the people in our communities.
Yeah, and I'm so grateful for you having me here to talk about this. I can't tell you how this has crippled law enforcement in New York State with the bail reform. So when this was instituted, what happened was they had a young man down in Rikers Island, and he passed away in custody. He was in on a robbery first charge, which is a serious charge. Usually that involves a weapon, robbery with a weapon or something of that nature. Anyways, he passed away in Rikers, and there was a big outcry because he didn't have, I think he only had like $1,000 or $500 bail. So there was a big outcry that this wasn't fair. He didn't have money, so he couldn't bail himself out. And then he died in custody down in Rikers. So that was the original reason and the thing that they wanted to fix with this issue. So instead of fixing that problem where, in my opinion, if you did away with cash bail altogether and allow your elected judge to have the ability to say, okay, you've been arrested 10 times, you're going to jail today, and I'm elected by the people, and I'm going to remand you to the county jail. They took all that discretion away where they just had to release them. So they basically took all felonies in the beginning and all misdemeanors, and we couldn't bring them to jail anymore or bring them for an arraignment. We had to give these people appearance tickets, and it was a disaster when they first implemented it. Things went wild. Criminals were offending, and they still are offending, reoffending, and just keep letting them out. Instead of having one stolen car, now the person's stealing 6 cars and getting released 3 times in the middle. So it was a disaster. They came back and they amended some of the domestic violence cases where we could bring them to get a arraigned then. But for the most part, it's still really bad in law enforcement out there as far as our ability to control criminals for the citizens that we're sworn to protect in this state.
Now, speaking of that, the state, this is an issue, obviously, there's been a problem for law enforcement throughout New York State. Upstate New York, I've talked to a lot of sheriffs that are very concerned. Even the changes that were made last year, the amendments, aren't quite enough to really be able to assure that our communities and law enforcement are going to be able to do their jobs.
Right. And they, it's funny because they talk about all these big crimes that they've made it better for domestic violence. I'll tell you what our problem is in law enforcement. It's like stealing a car, crashing the car and things like that, where we have to let these people go. So now you're not dealing with one stolen car that they crashed into a building and caused thousands of dollars of damage. It's 6 times, it's 7 times that the cops are going and dealing with the same people until they finally get to that threshold where the time's gone by where we can get them arraigned, or they've committed a serious enough offense that we can get them arraigned. So we'll have like drug addicts in our jail, and I've had parents plead with me, Sheriff, can you keep my kid in here? And I'm like, we can't do that. This is court mandated. I just can't say, okay, you're going to stay in jail. But should they be held on bail, or should they be remanded to a jail? When health is an issue for them and it's going to save their life, there's no more discretion in law enforcement where like a judge can come in or a district attorney can come in and say, okay, enough's enough. You've committed 6 crimes and, a week here, and you're going to go to jail today, and you're not going to have bail till your next court appearance.
I'm glad you brought that up about the district attorneys, because when the bill was being debated on the floor of the New York State Assembly, obviously I was there, and one of the questions that was brought up, or several questions that were brought up, had to do with whether or not people like yourself and like the district attorneys were referred to for any kind of input when this bill was being debated. And unfortunately, the answer was no. So this was a bill that was really passed in a vacuum as far as any information from folks like yourself that are on the front line and seeing the effects of what this bill had the potential to do. But of course, the New York State Legislature, in their infinite wisdom, went ahead. And again, this illustrates the one size does not fit all when it comes to New York City laws that are passed and their problems and what's going on in upstate New York. But this, again, is a statewide issue.
Yeah. And, we have sheriff's meetings, one in the winter, one in the summer, where all the sheriffs, I think there's 58 elected sheriffs in the state, and then there's 3 that are appointed throughout the state. So we all get together twice a year and we talk about these issues, not once. And if you talk to the District Attorneys Association, none of them were spoken to about this either. They didn't ask any of us our opinions about this, what the repercussions would be. This legislation was just pushed through, and it's really been crippling. It's totally in favor of the criminal without taking any consideration into public safety. What they essentially did is they tried an experiment, and they're experimenting with people's safety and the safety of our citizens. And there's a lot of extra deaths out there, a lot of car crashes. For people that should be in jail right now, and they're just not out. They're reoffending. They're using more and more drugs. You, on a Class A2 felony for drugs, which a Class A1 felony is killing a cop. So for a Class A2 felony, we have to release them. We could get them arraigned, but they're going to get kicked loose on it.
It's unacceptable.
We've had people with like 7 ounces of meth. We had one incident where a guy had 7 ounces of crystal meth in his car, and he had 2 active cooks going, meaning there's chemicals in the back of his car. He's driving around in it's manufacture of meth, and we had to let him go. The state police hazmat team had to get called in to handle it, and he went walking right down the street on his own after because it wasn't enough. It wasn't the A1 felony where we could bring him and get him arraigned.
I don't think that people, the average citizen in New York realizes the seriousness of this and the huge mistake, I should say, all right, in passing this legislation. Again, because it's going to affect people in all communities. It's not just an upstate or downstate problem. There's crime happening all over. One issue that was brought up by a constituent of mine who runs a drug intervention agency was that now they can no longer do an intervention because when someone was arrested on a drug-related crime, they had to spend time in prison or in jail, I should say, and the drug intervention agency would have time to set up some kind of intervention or interdiction, and now they're gone before they even have the chance to do that. So this is costing real lives. And now with 93,000 people dying of fentanyl and drug overdoses in this country in the past year, this is a problem that obviously we need to address, and we need to address this as soon as possible.
Yeah. And you see this liberal legislation across the country. Every place that they're trying this is a disaster. Look at the shootings. When they first made this switch, shootings went up in New York City where a bullet entered somebody's body. And 1 year after implementation of this, 138% in New York City were not just all crime, but where a bullet went into somebody's body from another person, 38%. The first year. And we're in the 3rd year now of it, and so you can just imagine what the crime stats are out there across the state. They are off the charts.
Yeah, and we see along with this defund the police movement and these politicians, these liberal politicians, talking about making sure that they reappropriate monies or redirect monies away from police agencies, along with the fentanyl and the drug overdose problems. This is almost the perfect storm right now, all right, for law enforcement who is being hobbled by these liberal policies. And now criminals being given more latitude than law enforcement does to do their job. This is a recipe for disaster. And, it's our hope that people will recognize this, make sure that the police and law enforcement are given the tools that they deserve to be able to do their job. So again, these liberal policies are striking home now. And I think that eventually people are going to come to the realization you're going in the wrong direction. We want our safety. We're taxpayers. We're family. We have families here. We want them protected as they should be.
Yeah, and how bad does it have to get till people realize that? In my opinion, we're in a crisis right now with all of this. how bad does it have to get before we can't get the voting turned around, where we get some of these people out of there who are voting this legislation in? You know, because in my opinion, things are out of control. You know, when I'll give you an example of like a car crash. We had one person, she just pled out to state prison, but she was out on drug priors from Oneida County and Onondaga County, got released on both of those, high on meth, fentanyl, marijuana, crashes her car into a motorcyclist when she's out just driving around, should have been locked up the whole time, and killed him. Killed a father of four, you know. And
horrible.
So
horrible.
All these stories, and this is just from our county. I mean, if you go around and look at across the state, just the multitude of crimes and deaths that are going on, I just wonder, you know, why there isn't more public outcry from people as to what's going on here and to fix this thing. You know, I just it's very, very difficult for me.
Well, obviously, people have been severely distracted by COVID, you know, by the pandemic. But a lot of the numbers are starting to show that that's actually increasing the number of crimes, the number of alcohol and drug abuse. So this, again, is something that we're looking at as the perfect storm. And sooner or later, we'll try to make some sense out of what's going on. But I have to admit, from being on the front line in the front lines in Albany, these politicians, these liberal politicians, just don't get it.
Well, look at the legislation that you put forth to repeal bail reform and to do away with cash bail altogether. I mean, that's great stuff. That, Assemblyman, that is the fix to all of our problems, the legislation that you put forth, right? It's that simple. It will solve all the problems that we have going on right now. Just repeal it. You've looked at the numbers. It was bad legislation. People are dying, and it's bad for society. And then allow your local judges to have the ability to put somebody in jail once they decide and they have discretion again, and nobody wants to hear it. You know, we've had numerous press conferences where we've tried to get people on board, and hopefully, you know, this November, you know, maybe we can get some results here as far as getting this fixed.
Yeah, because you have a legislature that's out of control. And now, of course, we have this issue with the governor. And for whatever he was worth as far as leadership, in my opinion, it was bad leadership. But we're going to have a vacuum there and people being able to direct what's going to be going on in Albany. But, you know, I appreciate you mentioning our legislation. What we're essentially asking for is repeal it and go back to the drawing board. Look, you and I have talked about this at length. No one wants to see anybody in jail any longer than they have to be because they don't have the financial means to get out. But it's done the exact opposite now. Is it's actually doing more harm than good to a lot of these people who should be having some services offered to them. Like you said, you've had parents say, please, you know, lock my kid up because the kid is probably going to die if he goes back out on the street. And they have.
We've had people released from jail and they'll go right out. You know, their levels are down. They've been in jail. They got some of the drugs out of their system, and they try to go back to that same amount of drugs they were using illegally, and they die of overdose. You know,
one thing that I use a lot of as far as what's in regards to the way Albany does things is there's an old saying, right church, wrong pew. You got a great intent, but the way you wrote the bill, because of the lack of input that you got from people who it's going to affect, because a lot of politics got involved, a lot of this horse trading that goes on all the time in Albany, you know, the lobbyists and what their influence is, that you're seeing these laws that have a good intent, but when they're finally passed, the results are horrible. So, you know, this is why it's so important that we do these shows, because people have to know what's going on right underneath their noses. They have to see and know what's going on in Albany and how it's affecting their daily lives. It's not just something that happens 90 miles east of here. These are things that are affecting you, they're affecting me, they're affecting our families, and people have got to be made aware of what's going on. And I appreciate you, all right, taking a stand as strongly as you have. It's been an honor to work with you on this, and I think guardedly optimistic. I think that if we keep on pushing these issues, keep on pushing the ill effects that it's having in our communities, that we're going to be able to get some action sooner or later.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. And unfortunately, you're right. You know, unfortunately, there's people dying while we're waiting for this change, and we see the easy fix. Okay, do away with cash bail altogether. It's done. Now we have discretion. Your elected judge can say, okay, you've done this 5 times now, you're going to jail today, or this is your first time, you've never done anything like this before, this was a mistake, and I'm going to ROR you, show up at court your next day. That's the easy fix, and the more we can get that word out by shows just like this, the better off we're going to be, in my opinion.
Yeah, knowledge is power.
Yes.
There's no doubt about it.
Yeah.
And we obviously see the disastrous effects of a lot of legislation coming out of Albany. The Farm Bill was another one where it really hit our farmers when they were down with very, very little input from them. And our local politicians and our statewide politicians had to be made aware. And, we're going to make them aware because I know in my heart of hearts, we've got the people's support. They see what's going on, and we're going to carry that message. But I want to thank you, Sheriff, for being here today. It's great working with you on these, and we know we're not alone, and we're ready to roll up our sleeves and fight the good fight.
No,
but I want to thank you for being here.
Yeah, I appreciate that also.
Okay.
Yep.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.